once after midnight. They leave at dawn. They always leave at dawn. 30 years I've been here. 30 years I've kept the light. The secret.
The following is a compiled transcript from multiple sources. Audio recordings recovered from Cragg Island Lighthouse, Maine, dated between 1989 and 2019. Video footage from a documentary cruise visit in October 2019, and the final Coast Guard incident report filed on November 3, 2019. Some portions have been reconstructed from written journals found at the location. The keeper's voice, where noted, comes from deteriorating cassette tapes he recorded over 3 decades of isolation. The boat that brought supplies to Cragg Island every 3 months was called the Margaret Ann, and on June 14, 1989, it carried a single passenger who would not leave the rock for 30 years. His name was Harold Marsh, 62 years old at the time, a former merchant marine who had requested the most isolated posting the Coast Guard Auxiliary could offer. The island sat 11 miles off the coast of Maine, nothing more than a jagged finger of granite thrusting up from the north. Atlantic, crowned by a lighthouse that had been automated in 1977, but still required a human presence for maintenance and emergency protocols. Harold had been told the previous keeper lasted 8 months before requesting transfer, citing the isolation. The one before that made it 14 months. The record was 2 years and 3 months, set in 1952, by a man named Douglas Fenn, who, according to local fishermen, was never quite right in the head after he came back to the mainland. Harold listened to these warnings with the patience of a man who had already decided, nodded politely, and stepped off the Margaret Ann onto the concrete pier with a single duffel bag over his shoulder. Captain Roy Delacroix, who piloted the supply boat, would later tell reporters that Harold's last words to him that day were peculiar. He said Harold looked up at the lighthouse, squinting against the June sun, and muttered something about how the light looked different during the day, almost friendly, and that he figured they'd get along fine as long as they both understood the rules. Roy asked him what rules he meant. Harold just smiled and said he'd figure them out soon enough. The first recording found on Cragg Island was dated June 19, 1989, 5 days after Harold's arrival. His voice on the tape is calm, almost cheerful. The voice of a man settling into solitude, the way others might settle into a warm bath. He describes the lighthouse in detail, narrating as if for an audience he never expected would listen, explaining that the tower stands 94 feet from base to lantern room, that the walls are 4 feet thick at the foundation and taper to 18 inches at the top, that the spiral staircase contains 112 steps, and he knows this because he counted them twice on his first day, once going up and once coming down. The keeper's quarters are attached to the base of the tower, he explains, a modest 2-room structure with a kitchen that still has a working wood stove and a bedroom facing east, so the morning sun comes through the window like a visitor. He sounds content. He mentions that the automated light requires minimal maintenance, just cleaning the lens once a week, checking the backup generator, monitoring the fog signal equipment. Most of his time, he says, will be his own. He plans to read. He brought 17 boxes of books. He plans to fish when the weather permits. He plans to listen to the radio in the evenings and write. Letters he'll send out on the supply boat. He does not mention the water. Not once in that first recording does Harold Marsh acknowledge the Atlantic Ocean that surrounds him on all sides, the water that stretches to the horizon in every direction, the dark, churning presence that makes Cragg Island what it is. This absence would become significant later. The second recording is dated June 27th, 8 days later. Harold's voice has changed, though not dramatically. There is a tightness to it, a careful quality, as if he is choosing his words with more precision than before. He begins by discussing the weather, a fog bank that rolled in 3 days ago and hasn't lifted, so thick he cannot see the water from the lighthouse gallery even at midday. He mentions that the fog signal has been running almost continuously, that deep mechanical groan that pulses every 30 seconds, and that he has grown accustomed to it, the way a person grows accustomed to a heartbeat. Then he pauses on the taper, a long silence filled only with the distant moan of the horn, and when he speaks again his voice is lower, almost confessional. He says he needs to document something even though it will sound foolish. He says on the night of June 24th, around 2 in the morning, he woke to a sound that was not the fog signal. It came from outside, from the water, a sound he cannot adequately describe except to say it was like singing, or not singing exactly, more like the memory of singing, the shape a song would leave behind if the song itself had been removed. He lay in bed listening to it for what felt like hours. He did not get up. He did not look out the window. He cannot explain why, but something in him understood that looking would be a mistake. The sound faded around 4 in the morning, replaced by the familiar rhythm of the horn. When dawn came, he walked the perimeter of the island and found nothing unusual, no evidence of boats or visitors, no explanation. He says he is recording. This for the sake of completeness, nothing more. He does not believe in supernatural phenomena. He spent 30 years at sea and never saw anything he couldn't explain eventually. But he wants a record, just in case. Just in case of what? He doesn't say. The recordings from July through September of 1989 are sporadic, sometimes weeks apart, and they document Harold's gradual adjustment to island life. He talks about the seabirds, thousands of them nesting on the eastern cliffs, their constant noise during daylight hours. He talks about the supply visits, how Roy Delacroix always stays for coffee and shares news from the mainland, how those 3 hours of human contact every 3 months become a kind of holiday. He talks about the books he's reading, Melville and Conrad and London, the great writers of the sea, and how their words feel different when you're living inside the reality they describe. He does not mention the singing again until October 3rd. On that recording, his voice has acquired a new quality, something between resignation and resolve. He says the sound has returned, always between midnight and 4 in the morning, always from the water on the western side of the island, always that same impossible quality of music that isn't quite music. He has developed a theory. He believes it might be some acoustic phenomenon, the way the waves interact with the underwater geology around the island, perhaps combined with wind patterns and the particular shape of the cliffs. Sound can do strange things in isolated environments. He read about it. There are documented cases. He is not concerned, but he has also developed a rule, and this is the first time he articulates it clearly. He does not look at the water after midnight. He does not specify why. He does not claim anything will happen if he does. He simply states it as a fact, the way a person might state that they don't eat shellfish or that they never drive on the freeway. It is a personal boundary. It feels correct. The recordings from October through December are missing or perhaps were never made. The next one is dated January 8th, 1990, and Harold sounds like a different man. His voice is older, hollowed out, and he speaks about the winter storms the way a soldier might speak about combat, with the weary authority of survival. He says the waves during the December gales reached 40 feet and struck the island with enough force to shake the lighthouse to its foundations. He says there were 4 nights when he was certain he would die, when the wind screamed through every crack in the keeper's quarters, and the spray from the crashing waves reached the gallery 90 feet above sea level. He says he did not sleep during those nights, could not sleep, and that the singing was louder than he had ever heard it, audible even over the shriek of the storm, and that several times he felt an almost physical compulsion to walk outside and look down at the water, to see what was making that sound, and that resisting this compulsion required more willpower than he knew he possessed. He did not look. He will never look. He understands now that the rule is not arbitrary, that he did not invent it, but rather discovered it, the way a navigator discovers a reef by nearly running aground. Something is in the water around Cragg Island. He does not know what it is. He does not want to know. His only task is to keep the light burning and to never, under any circumstances, look at the water after midnight. The years accumulate on the tapes like sediment, each one adding another layer to Harold Marsh's strange existence. By 1992, his speech patterns have shifted to those of a man who rarely uses his voice, hesitant and rusty, often trailing off mid-sentence as if he's forgotten that someone might be listening. He still records regularly, always during daylight hours, always in the kitchen with its eastern-facing window where the morning sun makes him feel, he says, like a normal person doing normal things. He describes his routines with the obsessive detail of a man who has come to understand that routine is the only thing standing between sanity and the alternative. He wakes at 5:30 each morning, makes coffee on the wood stove, eats breakfast while listening to the maritime weather forecast on the radio. He climbs the tower at 7 Quorn to check the light, polish the lens if needed, record any observations in the official logbook that gets collected every 3 months. He spends his mornings reading, his afternoons maintaining the island's infrastructure, his evenings cooking dinner and listening to whatever radio programs he can pick up from the mainland. He goes to bed at 9 p.m., always, without exception, because sleep is his protection, and he has trained himself to fall asleep quickly and to sleep deeply, so deeply that the singing cannot reach him, or at least cannot reach him in a way that compels him to wake and look. He never mentions what happens on the nights when sleep eludes him. He never mentions the windows that face west, but there is one recording, dated March 15, 1992, that deviates from his usual pattern. It is made at 3:47 in the morning, and his voice on the tape is barely a whisper. He says he needs to document what just happened, because he is afraid he will convince himself it was a dream if he doesn't. He says he woke at 3:15 to the singing, louder than usual, and that he lay in bed with his eyes closed, trying to will himself back to sleep, and that he felt something in the room with him. Not a presence exactly, more like an attention, as if something was watching him from very close by, waiting to see what he would do. He says he did not open his eyes. He says he lay perfectly still for 32 minutes, counting his breaths, and that eventually the feeling faded along with the singing. He says he made coffee and recorded this message, and that he will not speak of it again. He does not speak of it again. By 1995, Harold Marsh had become something of a legend among the fishermen and Coast Guard personnel who operated in the waters off eastern Maine. The lighthouse keeper who never left, they called him. The hermit of Cragg Island. Roy Delacroix, who still piloted the supply boat, had tried several times to draw Harold into conversation about why he stayed, what kept him on that barren rock year after year when most keepers couldn't last a single winter. Harold's answers were always vague, deflections dressed up as explanations. He said he liked the solitude. He said the mainland had nothing for him anymore. He said he had made a kind of peace with the island, and that leaving would feel like breaking a promise. Roy noticed other things too, things he didn't know how to interpret. He noticed that Harold never mentioned the water, never talked about fishing or swimming, or even the weather as it related to the sea, only the weather as it related to the sky, the wind, the temperature. He noticed that Harold's quarters contained no west-facing furniture, that the single chair in the kitchen was positioned to face east, that the bed in the bedroom was pushed against the eastern wall with a heavy curtain covering the western window. He noticed that Harold's complexion had taken on a greyish pallor despite the ample sun, and that his eyes, which had been a sharp blue when he first arrived, had faded to something closer to the colour of fog. Roy mentioned these observations to the Coast Guard station in Machias, more as curiosity than complaint, and was told that Harold Marsh passed his annual psychological evaluations, that the lighthouse was maintained to standard, and that what a man did in his solitude was his own business. The recordings from this period are increasingly sparse. Harold's voice, when it appears, sounds like it's coming from very far away, even though the tape player was found less than 3 feet from where he sat. He talks about the light. He talks about his books. He talks about the birds. He does not talk about the water. The year 2000 brought a documentary crew to Cragg Island, the first visitors besides Roy Delacroix that Harold had received in more than a decade. They were graduate students from Boston University, working on a project about isolated maritime communities, and they had heard about the legendary keeper who had spent 11 years alone on a rock in the Atlantic. Harold agreed to be interviewed, which surprised everyone. Though he set conditions, they could film during daylight hours only. They could not film the water from the lighthouse gallery, and they had to leave before sunset. The students thought these restrictions were eccentric but harmless, the quirks of a man who had spent too long alone. They arrived on the morning supply boat and spent 6 hours on the island, filming the lighthouse, the keeper's quarters, the rocky shoreline, and Harold himself sitting in his east-facing chair, answering questions. With the careful precision of someone translating from a foreign language, the footage, which was never formally released but copies of which circulated among film students for years afterward, shows a man who appears much older than his 73 years, thin to the point of gauntness, with hands that tremble slightly even when resting in his lap. His eyes, throughout the interview, never look directly at the camera. They drift constantly toward the eastern window, as if checking that the sun is still there, still marking the hours that separate day from night. When asked about his 3 decades on the island, Harold speaks in generalities. When asked about the challenges of isolation, he talks about weather and supply logistics. When asked if he ever gets lonely, he pauses for so long that one of the students later reported thinking the equipment had malfunctioned. Then he says something that would become the most analyzed moment in the entire documentary. He says loneliness is not the danger people think it is. He says the real danger is attention. He says if you are quiet enough, still enough, small enough, you can live in places that would destroy a louder soul. He says this island has eyes and ears and a kind of patience that has nothing to do with time as humans understand it, and that he has survived by becoming invisible to that patience, by refusing to see what wants to be seen, by keeping his eyes on the light and never on the water. When asked what he means by this, Harold looks directly at the interviewer for the first and only time in the footage. His eyes, the students would later say, were not the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years alone. They were the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years accompanied. He says very quietly that he has already said too much. He asks them to leave. They leave. The documentary was never completed. The recordings from 2001 through 2018 form the bulk of the recovered material. Over 200 cassette tapes stored in chronological order in a filing cabinet in the keeper's quarters. Harold's voice on these tapes evolves in ways that are difficult to categorize. Some days he sounds almost normal, like a retiree discussing his garden, chatting amiably about a book he's reading, or a storm that passed through, or the particular quality of light on a clear winter morning. Other days his voice has a compressed quality, squeezed thin by some pressure he never names, and he speaks in clipped fragments that barely qualify as sentences. The content of the recordings becomes increasingly repetitive, the same observations about birds and weather and light cycling back on themselves like waves against rock. But certain details emerge, details that Harold seems to slip in almost accidentally, as if some part of him wants to document what the rest of him refuses to acknowledge. In a recording from September 2003, he mentions that he has started wearing earplugs at night, industrial-grade hearing, protection designed for heavy machinery, because the singing has grown louder and more insistent over the years, and that even with the earplugs he can feel it vibrating through the floor and the walls and the mattress and his own bones. In a recording from February 2007, he mentions that the western window in the bedroom now has 3 layers of blackout curtains plus wooden boards nailed to the frame, because light from the water sometimes comes through at night, light that is not the lighthouse beam, light that moves in patterns that suggest intention. In a recording from July 2011, he mentions that Roy Delacroix has retired and that the new supply boat captain, a younger man named Pete Conroy, asked Harold why he never comes down to the pier when the boat arrives, why he always waits in the keeper's quarters until the supplies have been unloaded and the boat has departed. Harold says he told Pete it was a matter of preference. He does not tell Pete, or the recording, the real reason that the path from the keeper's quarters to the pier runs along the western edge of the island, and that in recent years he has become unable to walk that path without feeling watched, without hearing the faint echo of singing even in broad daylight, without seeing movement in his peripheral vision that vanishes when he turns to look. He has not been to the pier in 4 years. He has the supplies left at a designated spot that he retrieves after the boat is safely over the horizon. He knows this makes him seem insane. He does not care. Sanity, he says in a recording from 2013, is a luxury for people who don't know what he knows. The final chapter of Harold Marsh's time on Cragg Island began in October 2019, 30 years and 4 months after his arrival, when a routine Coast Guard inspection revealed concerns about the keeper's health and mental state. The inspector, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, documented in her report that Harold appeared severely malnourished, disoriented, and possibly suffering from delusions related to his prolonged isolation. She recommended immediate evacuation and psychological evaluation. Harold refused. He refused calmly, politely, with the patience of a man who had been expecting this moment for decades. He explained that he could not leave the island, that the lighthouse needed him, that no one else could be trusted to follow the rules that kept everyone safe. When asked what rules he meant, Harold became agitated for the first time. He said they wouldn't understand. He said no one who hadn't spent 30 years listening to the singing could understand. He said the light wasn't just for ships, that the light held something back, that as long as the light kept burning, and as long as someone kept not looking at the water after midnight, everything would be fine. Everything would stay in balance. But if that balance was disturbed, if the rules were broken, then what was in the water would know it had permission to come up. Lieutenant Commander Chen's report noted that Harold had become increasingly incoherent and that she was initiating procedures for involuntary evacuation based on mental health concerns. The evacuation was scheduled for November 2nd. The Coast Guard cutter Reliance arrived at Cragg Island on the morning of November 2nd, 2019, carrying a crew of 6 plus a medical officer and 2 representatives from the Maine Department of Health and Human Services. The weather was clear, unusual for that time of year, with calm seas and excellent visibility. The team approached the island at 9:45 a.m. and noted that the lighthouse beam was still operational despite it being full daylight, rotating steadily in its programmed pattern. They also noted that no one came to meet them at the pier. Lieutenant Commander Chen led the team up the path to the keeper's quarters, calling out Harold's name as they approached. There was no response. The door to the keeper's quarters was unlocked but barricaded from the inside with furniture, forcing the team to enter through a side window. What they found inside was documented in photographs that remain classified under Maine state law. The kitchen was orderly, except for a stack of cassette tapes on the table, each one labeled with a date and a short description written in increasingly shaky handwriting. The bedroom was a different matter. The western window had been completely sealed, not just with curtains and boards, but with concrete that appeared to have been hand-mixed and applied in multiple layers over many years. The bed had been moved to the far eastern corner, as far from the western wall as possible, and surrounded by a perimeter of salt that formed an unbroken line around the mattress. On the mattress, lying on his back with his eyes open and his hands folded on his chest, was Harold Marsh. He was dead. The medical officer estimated he had been dead for approximately 12 to 16 hours, which placed the time of death somewhere between 6 p.m. on November 1st and 2 a.m. on November 2nd. The cause of death was initially listed as heart failure related to malnutrition and advanced age. This determination would later be revised, then revised again, then finally left blank in the official report. The footage that changed everything was discovered 3 days later, when a Coast Guard technician reviewing the lighthouse's automated monitoring system found a camera that no one knew existed. It had been installed by Harold himself sometime in the late 1990s, positioned in the lantern room and pointed not outward toward the sea, but downward toward the gallery walkway that circled the lighthouse at the 90-foot level. The camera was motion-activated and recorded to a hard drive hidden in the lighthouse's mechanical room. It had been recording for over 20 years. Most of the footage showed nothing. Seabirds landing on the railing, maintenance crews during inspections, Harold himself performing his weekly cleaning routine. But the final recording, timestamped 11:47 p.m. on November 1st, 2019, showed something different. It showed Harold climbing the spiral staircase with the slow, painful movements of a man whose body had aged beyond its capacity. It showed him reaching the lantern room and standing in the center of the rotating beam, his face illuminated in 5-second intervals as the light swept past. It showed him standing there for over an hour, not moving, not speaking, just watching the beam rotate and cast its light out over the water. Then, at 12:58 a.m., the footage shows Harold doing something he had not done in 30 years. He walked out onto the gallery. He gripped the railing with both hands, and he looked down at the water. The camera's angle does not show what Harold saw. It shows only his face, lit intermittently by the rotating beam, and the expression that crossed his features in the 60 seconds between when he looked down and when the footage ends. The Coast Guard's official report describes his expression as one of extreme terror. The medical officer who reviewed the footage described it differently. She said Harold looked like a man who had just had a question answered, a question he had been asking for 30 years, and that the answer was worse than he had feared, but also exactly what he expected. The footage ends at 12:59 a.m., when Harold turns away from the railing and walks back into the lantern room. The camera's motion sensor did not trigger again until the Coast Guard team arrived the following morning. Harold's body was found in the bedroom, in the same position described earlier, with no indication of how he traveled from the lighthouse gallery to his bed after the recording ended. The automated lighthouse log shows that the beacon experienced a brief malfunction at 1:03 a.m., going dark for 17 seconds before resuming normal operation. The log also shows something else, something that the Coast Guard initially dismissed as a sensor error. During those 17 seconds of darkness, the underwater sonar system detected movement around the base of the island. The movement was later analyzed by oceanographic specialists who concluded it could not have been caused by any known marine animal, geological shift or weather event. One specialist, speaking off the record, said the pattern of movement suggested something large, surfacing from deep water, circling the island once, then descending again, when the light resumed. He said the scale of the movement indicated an object at least 400 feet in length, though he stressed that the data was incomplete and his analysis should not be considered definitive. His analysis was not included in the final report. Harold Marsh was buried on Cragg Island per instructions found in his personal effects, in a grave he had apparently dug himself years earlier on the eastern shore, as far from the water as the island's geography would allow. A new keeper was not assigned. The Coast Guard cited budget constraints and the increasing automation of lighthouse systems, but internal communications obtained through a Freedom of Information request suggest other factors were considered. One email, dated November 15, 2019, from the station commander in Machias to the regional coordinator in Boston, mentions that 2 personnel who participated in the recovery operation had submitted immediate transfer requests, both citing personal reasons. Another email, dated November 29th, notes that 3 of the 6 cassette tapes removed from the island for analysis had been reported missing from the evidence locker, with no record of who had accessed them or where they had been taken. A third email, dated December 12th, contains only a single question. Did anyone else hear singing during the approach? The regional coordinator's response, if one was sent, does not appear in the released documents. The lighthouse itself continues to operate. On its automated system, its beam rotating every 30 seconds through the long Maine nights, casting light out over the dark Atlantic water where something may or may not be waiting, patient as stone, for the next person who looks down after midnight. The last cassette tape recovered from Harold Marsh's collection was dated October 29, 2019, 3 days before his death. It is the only recording in which Harold directly addresses a potential listener, speaking not to himself or to the vague future audience he occasionally acknowledged, but to someone specific, someone he seems to believe will one day find these tapes and need to understand what happened on Cragg Island. His voice on this final recording is calm, calmer than it has been in years, the voice of a man who has made peace with something terrible. He says he knows he is dying. He says the supplies haven't been coming as regularly, or maybe he has been losing track of time, or maybe it doesn't matter anymore. He says his body has given him what it could, and asked for nothing in return, and that seems like a fair arrangement for 92 years of life. He says he is not afraid of death. He is afraid of what comes after, not in the religious sense but in the practical sense, afraid of what will happen to the island and the light and the thing in the water when he is no longer here to keep the balance. He says he has tried to write down the rules, but the rules don't make sense when you write them down. They only make sense when you live them. When you feel the weight of 30 years of not looking pressing against the back of your eyes every time the sun sets. He says whoever finds these tapes, if anyone ever finds them, should understand that he did not choose this life, not really, that the life chose him the same way the sea chooses what it takes and what it leaves behind. He says the singing is beautiful. He has never admitted this before. He says it has always been beautiful, from the very first. Night, a beauty so profound that resisting it required every ounce of will he possessed, and that the only way to resist was to never look, because looking would make the beauty complete, would give it the acknowledgement it craved, and once you acknowledged it, you belonged to it forever. He says he doesn't know what's in the water. He spent 30 years not knowing, and he will die not knowing, and that is exactly as it should be. Some things are not meant to be known. Some things can only be survived. The tape ends with the sound of Harold standing up from his chair, walking across the room and opening a door. There is a brief rush of wind, the cry of distant seabirds, and underneath it, so faint that it might be imagination or static or something else entirely, the suggestion of a melody rising from the direction of the sea. The lighthouse on Cragg Island continues to operate under automated control. 3 inspection teams have been assigned to the station since Harold Marsh's death. All 3 requested reassignment after a single visit, citing various personal and professional reasons. Local fishermen report avoiding the waters around the island after dark, though none will explain why when asked. The singing has been reported by 17 different sources between November 2019 and the present day, including Coast Guard vessels, commercial fishing boats, and a passenger ferry that experienced engine failure 3 miles west of the island in August 2022. In each case, the witnesses described the sound the same way Harold Marsh described it in his recordings. Not quite music, not quite voice, but the memory of both, rising from the water in the hours after midnight, beautiful and patient, and waiting for someone to look down. The following addendum was compiled from materials obtained through ongoing Freedom of Information requests, interviews conducted by independent researchers, and a single video file uploaded anonymously to a maritime history forum in March 2024 before being removed by site administrators. Its authenticity remains disputed. The first person to spend a full night on Cragg Island after Harold Marsh's death was a graduate student named Emily Vance, 29 years old, working on her doctoral thesis in folklore studies at the University of Maine. She had become obsessed with the Marsh recordings after a digitized copy of one tape surfaced on an academic file-sharing network in early 2023, and she had spent 18 months petitioning the Coast Guard for access to the island, the remaining tapes, and any documentation related to what she called the Cragg Island acoustic phenomenon. Her requests were denied repeatedly until February 2024, when a sympathetic administrator granted her a 48-hour research permit under the condition that she sign a liability waiver and agree to psychological evaluation upon her return. Emily arrived on the island on March 3, 2024, aboard a chartered fishing vessel whose captain, a man named Dennis Proctor, refused to stay past 4:00 p.m. He told her he would return at 8:00 a.m. the following morning, and that if she wasn't at the pier when he arrived, he would radio the Coast Guard and leave without her. Emily asked him why he wouldn't anchor overnight. Dennis looked at the lighthouse, then at the water, then at Emily with an expression she would later describe as something between pity and fear. He said some places don't want company after dark. He said his grandfather had fished these waters for 50 years and only mentioned Cragg Island once on his deathbed, and what he said was that the light wasn't for the ships. Emily asked what he meant. Dennis said he didn't know and didn't want to know, and that she should consider whether she really needed to know either. Then he left. Emily's research equipment included 4 audio recorders positioned at different points around the island, a hydrophone designed to capture underwater sounds, 2 video cameras with night vision capability, and a personal voice recorder she kept on her at all times. She also brought Harold Marsh's journals, photocopies she had obtained through a source she refused to identify, and a notebook filled with 3 years of research into acoustic anomalies, infrasound phenomena, and the psychological effects of prolonged isolation. She did not believe in the supernatural. She believed in science, in documentation, in the human brain's remarkable capacity for pattern, recognition, and its equally remarkable capacity for seeing patterns where none exist. She believed Harold Marsh had been a lonely, disturbed man who had constructed an elaborate mythology to give meaning to his isolation, and that the singing he described was almost certainly a combination of whale song, underwater geological activity, and auditory hallucinations induced by decades of sensory deprivation. She intended to prove this. She intended to spend the night on Cragg Island, record whatever sounds occurred, analyze them with modern equipment, and publish a paper that would finally explain the legend of the lighthouse keeper who never looked at the water. She set up her equipment methodically, placing the hydrophone off the western pier, positioning the cameras to cover the approaches to the lighthouse, calibrating the audio recorders for maximum sensitivity. By 6:00 p.m., everything was ready. By 7:00 p.m., the sun had set. By 8:00 p.m., Emily was sitting in Harold Marsh's east-facing chair in the keeper's quarters, reading his journals by lamplight, waiting for midnight. The first anomaly appeared at 10:47 p.m. Emily noted it in her voice recorder with the clinical detachment of a trained researcher. The hydrophone was picking up low-frequency vibrations that did not match any known marine life in North Atlantic waters. The frequency was too low for whale song, too rhythmic for geological activity, too structured for random ocean noise. She described it as patterned infrasound, possibly biological in origin, source unknown. She did not describe it as singing. She did not use that word. But her voice on the recording, which was later recovered and analyzed by 3 separate audio forensics specialists, contains micro-tremors consistent with elevated stress response, and her breathing rate, audible in the background, had increased from 14 breaths per minute to 22. At 11:15 p.m., the vibrations intensified. Emily reported that the sound was now audible without equipment, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls and the floor and the air itself. She reported that the temperature in the keeper's quarters had dropped noticeably, despite the heating system functioning normally. She reported that one of her external cameras, the one positioned on the western side of the island, had stopped transmitting. She did not go outside to check on it. She stayed in the chair facing east, reading Harold Marsh's journals with increasing speed, as if looking for something specific, some instruction or warning that would tell her what to do next. At 11:58 p.m., Emily Vance made a decision that would define the rest of her life, however long that turned out to be. She put down the journals. She stood up from the chair. She walked to the door of the keeper's quarters, opened it, and stepped outside into the March night. Her voice recorder captured everything that followed, though portions of the audio are corrupted by interference that audio specialists have been unable to explain. She narrates her movements in a voice that starts steady and gradually becomes something else, something that sounds less like fear than like awe, the voice of a person witnessing something so far beyond their expectations that the normal categories of emotion no longer apply. She says she is walking toward the lighthouse. She says the light is rotating normally, every 30 seconds, casting its beam out over the water. She says the sound is louder now, not infrasound anymore, not vibration, but something her ears can actually hear, something that does sound like singing, exactly like Harold described, like the memory of music, like a song that has been waiting 30 years to be heard again. She says she is climbing the lighthouse stairs. She says she can feel the sound in her chest, in her teeth, in the spaces behind her eyes. She says it is beautiful. She says she understands now why Harold spent 30 years not looking, because not looking was the only way to resist, and she is not sure she wants to resist anymore. She says she is in the lantern room. She says the light is so bright up here, so bright and so warm, and the singing is so close, and all she has to do is walk outside and look down and finally understand what Harold understood, what Harold refused to understand, what Harold took to his grave, because some knowledge is too heavy to carry and too dangerous to share. The recording cuts out at 12:07 a.m. When it resumes, the timestamp shows 4:23 a.m., and Emily's voice is different, flat, emptied out. She says she is sitting on the floor of the lantern room. She says the singing has stopped. She says she did not look. She says she stood on the gallery walkway for 3 hours with her eyes closed, feeling the sound wash over her, feeling something vast and patient and unutterably ancient waiting just below the surface of the water, and she did not look. She says she understands Harold now. She says some questions are not meant to be answered. She says she is going to destroy her equipment and her notes and her recordings, except for this one, which she will hide somewhere it might be found by someone who needs to know that the legend is true, that something lives in the water around Cragg Island, something that has been there longer than the lighthouse, longer than the island, longer than anything that human beings have names for. She says the singing will come back tomorrow night and the night after that, and every night until someone finally looks down and gives it what it wants. She does not say what it wants. Maybe she doesn't know. Maybe she does know and cannot bring herself to speak it aloud. The recording ends with the sound of the lighthouse beam rotating, the cry of seabirds greeting the dawn, and underneath it all, so faint it might be nothing at all, a melody fading into silence. Dennis Proctor arrived at 8:00 a.m. on March 4, 2024. As promised, Emily Vance was waiting at the pier, He reported later that she looked different than she had the day before, older somehow, though he couldn't specify how. Her eyes, he said, had a quality he'd only seen once before, in his grandfather's eyes, in those final days when the old man was talking about Cragg Island and the light that wasn't for the ships. Emily didn't speak during the boat ride back to the mainland. She sat in the stern, facing away from the island, and never once looked back. She submitted her research permit documentation to the Coast Guard 3 days later, reporting that her investigation had been inconclusive due to equipment malfunction, and requesting that her permit be cancelled and her deposit returned. She did not publish a paper. She did not return to her doctoral program. According to university records, she withdrew from the University of Maine on March 15, 2024, citing personal reasons. Her current whereabouts are unknown. The single recording she chose to preserve was uploaded to the Maritime History Forum on March 22nd, where it remained for 6 hours before being removed. In that time, it was downloaded by approximately 400 users, though the file appears to have been corrupted during most download attempts, leaving only fragments of audio that researchers have been unable to fully reconstruct. The fragments that do exist contain Emily's voice describing the singing, the lighthouse, the feeling of something waiting in the water. They also contain, in the final seconds before the corruption renders the audio unintelligible, what sounds like Emily saying a single word, repeated 3 times. A word that different listeners have interpreted differently, but that most agree sounds like a name. The name has not been identified in any maritime records, any folklore databases, any historical documents related to Cragg Island or the coast of Maine. Several researchers have attempted to trace its etymology or find references to it in other acoustic anomaly reports. None have succeeded. None have continued their research for more than a few weeks before abandoning it, citing various reasons, none of which have been verified. The lighthouse on Cragg Island continues to operate. The singing continues to be reported. And somewhere in a location she has never disclosed, Emily Vance continues to not look at the water, the same way Harold Marsh did not look for 30 years, the same way whoever comes after her will have to not look if they want to survive. Because that is the truth at the heart of the legend, the truth that Harold understood and Emily learned, and that anyone who spends enough time near Cragg Island eventually discovers. The singing is not a threat, not exactly. It is an invitation. It has always been an invitation, and the only way to decline is to never, ever accept. On November 2nd, 2024, the 5th anniversary of Harold Marsh's death, the Coast Guard reported a brief malfunction in the Cragg Island Lighthouse system. The beacon went dark for 34 seconds, twice as long as the malfunction recorded on the night Harold died. Underwater sonar detected movement around the base of the island during this period. The movement was larger than any previously recorded, suggesting an object or entity in excess of 600 feet in length. When the light resumed, the movement ceased. The incident report was classified and has not been released to the public. Local fishermen, however, have reported that the singing is louder now, audible from further away, as if whatever waits in the water is growing impatient. As if 30 years of not looking was enough for Harold Marsh, but the debt has not been paid, only deferred. As if something is still waiting, patient as the tide, for someone to finally look down and answer the question it has been asking since before the lighthouse was built, since before the island rose from the sea, since before human beings had eyes to close or ears to cover, or minds capable of understanding that some invitations, once accepted, cannot be refused. The light continues to burn, the singing continues to rise, and the water, as always, continues to wait.